It is very interesting to contemplate what is happening in the world today and compare it to World War II. I'm not quite that old, but I am relatively close. One of the most heartbreaking times in World War II was when German bombers were bombing the city of London. The wife of King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, a woman whom Adolf Hitler called the most dangerous woman in the world because of her ability to always raise the morale of her people, made a request to the people of Great Britain that they would welcome children into their homes. Many of the children had never been out of London, and many had never left their families. But in true British fashion, people pulled together and made many places available to these children. One young brother and his little sister had just said goodbye to their parents, and they were seated on the train getting ready to leave London. As the train began to pull out of the station, the little girl began to cry, telling her brother that she was nervous because she didn't know where the train was going to take them. Her brother dried off her tears and then said, "No, we don't know where we're going. But we're not to worry about that because the Queen, she knows where we're going." Now, I doubt it very much that the Queen knew where every child was going. But this little boy and girl felt better knowing that their Queen was watching out for their best interests. Many of us today are facing a situation that is somewhat similar to these children. We are faced with the unknown of tomorrow. And by saying tomorrow, I don't necessarily mean April 4th, 2022. What I mean is that there is something major and imminent in our future that is in question. Some of you may feel as if you are in a storm, in a small boat that is in danger of sinking below the waves. Some of you may be in a different sort of storm. What you've been doing is coming to an end, and you don't know what the future holds. Some of you have work problems, and maybe your work is tenuous at best. Some of you will be finishing maybe an educational degree. But what will you be doing in 6 months, or in a year, or 10 years? Some of you have family members that are struggling with some major issue, health challenges, financial obligations and questions, broken relationships, or maybe it's you yourself that is going through these challenges. There are unknowns that all of us are facing today. When one is before a situation when you don't know what tomorrow holds, I believe that there are biblical principles upon which we can base our future. The first of these is that we should look backwards and see how God has helped us thus far. I found a quote about this that says, "I do not fear tomorrow because I remember yesterday." I do not fear tomorrow because I remember yesterday. There are a couple of verses that come to mind when thinking about yesterday. Do you remember when the Jewish people were crossing the Jordan River after they had wandered in the desert for 40 years and they were finally going into the promised land? Joshua chapter 4. Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 to 9. Listen. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, 'Take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight.' Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, 'Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder. according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, what do those stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant stood. And they are there to this day, a memorial for us. Facing future challenges, the Jews were to look at a pile of stones and remember that God had helped them miraculously in the past. Remember what God has done. Today, in our Lenten series on the miracles of Jesus, we're going to be looking at Jesus walking on water. I've called this sermon, Walking on Water When You Don't Know the Future. This miracle is found in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. Matthew has a few more details, and that will be our main text for today. We'll read all of Matthew 14, starting in verse 22 to 33, and then a bit of Mark 6 and a bit of John 6. And then we will begin in earnest our study. So turn with me, if you will, or take your devices or whatever you have with you, to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22. Immediately. Now, I'll stop right there. Matthew does not use the word immediately like Mark does. So when Matthew uses it, it's really there for a reason, to show something. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And then from Mark chapter 6, verses 47 and 48. Mark 6, 47 and 48. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. That was Mark chapter 6. And now John chapter 6, just verse 21. John 6, 21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. There is a lot of things in these 3 different passages, very similar, but also some little differences. Before we start today's passage, let's just take a few minutes and review what we're doing. The Lenten season, the time of Lent, are the 40 days before Easter, not counting Sundays. And this period of time is to help believers realize our need for Jesus in our lives. We are just humans. We are nothing but dust and ashes. Jesus is the only one who can really meet all of our needs. Why is that? The answer to that is why we are studying the miracles of Jesus during this season. Remember that miracles are a sign that point to something vitally important. And the ones that we have been looking at are pointing to who Jesus really is, namely God. We looked at the very first miracle done by Jesus, that of turning water into wine, where Jesus was willing to help in a personal situation, a wedding, by showing that he controls the physical properties of substances, that of changing water into wine without the use of any grapes. And this was not just done in a small manner, but he literally made the equivalent of 750 bottles of wine. And it was good wine. Jesus, the God of creation. Then we studied the first miraculous catch of fish, where Jesus is calling Simon to follow him as a disciple. But first, Jesus is asking for obedience on the part of Simon Peter. This miracle catch is showing the abundance that is the result of obeying Christ, so that two fairly large boats were almost sinking with the amount of fish that were caught. This is also when Simon Peter realizes how different he is than Jesus. He says, "I am a very sinful man. Depart from me," compared to the one who controls nature, Jesus, the Lord over creation. Then there was the miracle of healing two blind men and the man who was deaf and mute. Jesus was doing something here that was prophesied in the Old Testament, how the Messiah would bring sight to the blind and hearing and speech to the deaf and the mute. This was also showing Jesus' power over evil spirits. But the main teaching from these miracles was bringing spiritual sight to the spiritually blind and spiritual understanding to those who actually use their ears to hear and understand the Word of God. And this could only be done by God Himself. Jesus, Messiah, the sovereign of and the sovereign over creation. Last week, Pastor James preached on the miracle of feeding the 5,000, which was actually 5,000 men, meaning that there were probably 15,000 people altogether that were fed. This multiplication of the 5 brioche and the 2 sardines, like Pastor James said, was again showing the power of Jesus as the Creator, who has power over all creation, able to make something out of nothing, and how Jesus blesses in abundance and not just sufficiently. They ate, remember, as much as they wanted. Jesus, our abundant provider and creator. Each of these miracles were signs that pointed clearly to the fact that Jesus was God. Yet, this was not understood by the disciples, as we just read. Let's look further now at the miracle of Jesus walking on water, using Matthew's gospel as our text. Verse 22, chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately, he made the disciples get in the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. This is not the first time that Jesus has gone off to pray. This is how Jesus rejuvenated himself. He was alone. He had dismissed the crowd, who actually had wanted to make him king. But Jesus wasn't having any of it. He dismissed his groupies, the crowd. He sent them away. He went up onto a mountain, a place where he wouldn't be interrupted, and he prayed. Verse 24. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. I like the addition here of what Mark's gospel gives for this part of the story. Mark 6, verse 47. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. Here it is. The sun has set. It is dark. But Jesus still knew what his disciples were facing. Not out of sight and out of mind. He knew what they were going through. He saw in the dark that they were having trouble because of the wind. So sometime in the fourth watch, would be between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., Jesus decides to join his disciples on the other side of the lake. But instead of walking around the lake or taking another boat, he walks on the sea. Matthew 14:26. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." His purpose, according to what Mark shared, was to walk on by them, going to the other side. Mark said he meant to pass by them. But when the disciples saw Jesus, they were frightened and attributed this to the spirit world, calling Jesus a ghost, which would actually be saying that they thought Jesus was an evil spirit. Do you think that they really did not recognize Jesus even a little bit? They have just been with Jesus and seen all of these other miracles. They've begun to learn who Jesus really is. One would have hoped that they would have been quick to cry out, "Oh, it's the Lord, we're safe." But no. Mark tells us that in their hearts were hardened, and their reaction was to think that Jesus was a ghost. The Greek word that's used here is what we use today for the English word phantom. When the disciples cried out in fear, Jesus spoke to them, reassuring them of who he was. "It is I. It is I." More literally, this could be translated as I am. I am. This is a direct and conscious statement of Jesus stating that he was Yahweh, the I am of Exodus 3, verse 14. So even though this is somewhat veiled, it is perhaps Jesus' clearest self-revelation of his divinity to this point. But Peter, being Peter, needed a little bit more proof. Verse 28. And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" Isn't Peter's reaction to Jesus somewhat similar to our own reactions to the truths of Jesus? Peter recognized that this phantom indeed looked like Jesus. It sounded like Jesus, but he needed more proof. Aren't we often also asking for more proofs of God's power and mercy and love? We question whether God is really able to do what he says he will do. The motive for Peter's request is not really known, so we need to say that it's actually not relevant to this passage. Jesus didn't have to grant Peter's request, but Jesus wanted to teach another lesson. And so he replied to Peter very simply, "Come." Peter steps out of the boat and begins to walk on the sea to Jesus. But we know the rest of the story. Peter doesn't get too far before he notices the wind and the waves around him, and he doubts his ability to do what he is actually doing. This doubt shows that Peter really didn't have a full understanding of the faith that Jesus was wanting him to have, and the result was that he started to sink. Peter is unable to go on, and he begins to sink and cries out to Jesus as Lord and pleads to be saved from drowning. But don't be too fast to condemn Peter. He did, after all, step out of the boat. Jesus immediately responds. He didn't first say, "You need more faith. You need to show me that you repent from your doubt, that you're sorry." No, even though Peter's eyes had wandered off of Jesus, Jesus helped him anyway. Jesus loved Peter enough to help him even when he doubted. He loves us the same way. He might wait until we're at the end of our rope and about ready to sink and drown. Excuse me. But Jesus is still there. He had Peter's back, and he has your back. After Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of Peter, then Peter asked him why he was doubting. He was saying, "Don't you remember all of the other miracles? How many times have I let you down in the past? Do you remember the pile of stones that shows how I led you through the Jordan River? I've always had your back. I will never leave you alone." Matthew 14:32. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." In John's gospel account, we read verse 21, John 6:21. Then they were glad to take him in the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. What we see at the ending of this miracle is actually 3 more miracles. Jesus and Peter get into the boat, and the storm just stops. Then the boat is immediately transported to the land where they're headed. But the main miracle was the declaration of faith of those in the boat. Truly, you are the Son of God. Hearts had been changed. Blind eyes had actually seen. So, what type of application can I leave you with today? What can we learn from these miracles that will help us when we don't know what tomorrow holds? When we're in the midst of a storm ourselves and we think that God has abandoned us and just walking by our own sinking ship. First, remember that we do not need to fear tomorrow because we know what happened yesterday. God has always been faithful. He has always had your back. God is looking out for us. He knows when we are struggling at the oars of our boat. In the middle of a storm, He will not turn away. Second, we need to remember to do what Pastor James suggested we do during last week's applications. The first thing he said was, we need to get to know Christ more and to know Him better. This is done through spending more and more time with Him. Then Pastor James said we need to continue to be obedient to all of God's teaching and His leading. And lastly, he said we need to remember that in everything we are to glorify God. Where is our place? What controls our priorities? Pastor James' favorite verse that he shared again last week. He must increase, I must decrease. John 3:30. To close with, I want to go back to World War II. Back to World War II. It was Christmas Eve, 1946. King George VI was still reigning over Great Britain. We already heard about his wife, Queen Elizabeth, at the beginning of this sermon. London had been bombed. They were broke and barren of any hope of the future. That Christmas Eve night, King George VI got on the radio to make an address to his nation. These were the last known words he spoke to his nation before his death. I said to the man at the gate of the future, give me a light that I might walk safely into the unknown. He said to me, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. It will be much better than the light and safer than the unknown. May we have the wisdom and courage we need to face our unknown tomorrows with a faith in the person who holds tomorrow in His hands and who makes it possible for us to walk on water. Jesus, the Messiah, the creator of all creation, the sovereign of the universe, the one who has our backs, and the one who makes it possible for us to do the impossible. Amen. Pray. Father God, thank you for your word. Thank you for your promises that you are always there for us. Help us to remember. And Father, thank you that we know that you are in control, even if it doesn't seem like it today. In your name we pray. Amen.